Imagine being so skilled, so impossibly effective at what you do, that the most powerful dictator in modern history personally orders your elimination. Picture this. A single soldier, armed with nothing but a modified rifle, and years of patience learned in the Australian outback, becomes such a devastating force that he costs an entire army over 200 of its commanding officers. Now imagine that same dictator, consumed by rage and desperation, creates an elite death squad with one singular mission: hunt down and eliminate this man and his team at any cost. This isn't fiction. This isn't Hollywood exaggeration. This is the true story of how a humble sheep farmer from the Australian bush became the most feared sniper in World War II, and what happened when the hunter became the hunted. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of survival, skill, and an ending that will leave you speechless, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches across the globe. What I'm about to share with you is a chapter of World War II that military historians still study today. A story that challenges everything you think you know about warfare, humanity, and the thin line between enemy and equal. By 1942, the Wehrmacht's officer corps was hemorrhaging leadership at an unprecedented rate. Not from aerial bombardments or tank divisions, but from shadows in the desert, from silence in the forests, from ghosts that struck without warning and vanished without trace. The Australian 2nd Division sniper units had perfected a form of psychological warfare so devastating that it paralyzed entire German battalions. Officers refused to leave their bunkers. Commanders disguised their rank insignia. Radio communications became paranoid whispers about the invisible Australians. And at the center of this legend was one man, a 34-year-old whose name German soldiers would whisper in fear, whose confirmed kills would reach numbers that seemed impossible, whose very existence would provoke Adolf Hitler himself to declare, "I want these desert demons eliminated. I don't care what it costs." This is not just a war story. This is a story about what happens when raw talent meets impossible odds, when humility confronts arrogance, when wisdom born from solitude faces hatred born from ideology. His name was Thomas Callahan, though his mates called him Ghost, long before the Germans coined their own terrified nicknames for him. Tommy had spent 30 years of his life in the vast emptiness of Western Australia's sheep stations, where a man could walk for 3 days without seeing another human soul. Out there, he'd learned to read the land like a book. Every shift in wind direction, every change in animal behavior, every subtle variation in light and shadow. He could track a dingo across stone, predict weather patterns by watching ants, and most importantly, he'd learned the ancient art of absolute stillness. The Aboriginal stockmen he'd worked alongside had taught him something the military manuals never could. Patience isn't just waiting, it's becoming part of the environment itself, breathing with the earth's rhythm, thinking like the prey you're hunting. When war came, Tommy had enlisted quietly, without fanfare, expecting to serve as just another soldier. He was older than most recruits, weathered and humble, the kind of man who spoke rarely and never about himself. His superiors almost overlooked him entirely until the rifle range qualification day, when this unassuming sheep farmer proceeded to put every single shot through the exact same hole at 300 yards using iron sights, in a crosswind. The range officer had literally stopped the exercise, convinced there was a malfunction. There wasn't. Tommy Callahan simply didn't miss. What made Tommy different wasn't just his preternatural marksmanship. Plenty of soldiers could shoot straight. It was his philosophy about it. While other snipers collected notches on their rifle stocks, Tommy kept a small notebook filled with sketches and observations about birds he'd seen in different territories, pressed flowers from battlefields, and brief reflections on the landscape. He never celebrated a kill. In fact, he rarely spoke about his work at all. To him, sniping wasn't about glory or revenge. It was about ending the war one strategic shot at a time, protecting his mates, and somehow preserving a small piece of his humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. He'd been raised by a widowed mother who quoted Marcus Aurelius and taught him that true strength was gentleness, that real power lay in restraint. These weren't values the military typically celebrated, but they made Tommy something unprecedented. A warrior who killed with precision but never with hatred, who saw his enemies as human beings, even as he ended their lives from distances they never knew he occupied. This contradiction, this fierce compassion, would become the very thing that would save him when death came hunting. The German High Command first learned something was catastrophically wrong in August 1942, when a decorated panzer regiment in North Africa lost 3 officers in a single afternoon. The casualties weren't clustered in battle. They happened hours apart, miles away from each other, each officer killed by a single shot through a gap in their observation post fortifications that shouldn't have been possible to Exploit. No sound, no muzzle flash detected. No sign of the shooter. It was surgical. It was terrifying. Within 3 months, the reports multiplied exponentially. A battalion commander in Tunisia eliminated while inspecting forward positions. An artillery spotter killed instantly while calculating trajectories from what he believed was a secure location. An intelligence officer shot dead through the narrow vision slit of his command vehicle. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was systematically decapitating the Wehrmacht's command structure, and doing it with such ghost-like efficiency that frontline troops began circulating rumors that the British had deployed some kind of supernatural entity. The truth, as intelligence officers eventually pieced together from interrogated prisoners and recovered equipment, was somehow more disturbing. It was a small unit of Australian marksmen, led by an older man with a modified Lee Enfield 303, who moved through no man's land like they were born there, who could remain motionless for 18 hours waiting for a single shot, who understood desert terrain better than soldiers who'd trained in North Africa for years. The revelation reached Hitler's headquarters through a series of increasingly desperate reports. The Führer's reaction was volcanic. He'd already been frustrated by the North African campaign's stagnation, and now to learn that a handful of colonial troops were paralyzing his officer corps with sniper fire was an intolerable humiliation. In a meeting that military historians later documented through surviving adjutant notes, Hitler allegedly slammed his fist on the war table and declared these Australian snipers to be the most dangerous men in the theater. More dangerous than tanks, more dangerous than artillery. Because they kill leadership and they kill morale. What followed was unprecedented. Hitler personally authorized the creation of Jagdkommando units, hunter commandos, whose sole mission was counter-sniper operations targeting specifically Australian marksmen. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were handpicked from the Wehrmacht's most elite units, given the finest optics and rifles Germany could produce, and they were told that their success would be measured by one metric alone: confirmed kills of enemy snipers. Leading this new unit was Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a decorated Eastern Front veteran who'd survived 3 years of brutal combat, a man whose own sniper skills had earned him commendations and whose cold efficiency had earned him fear. Steiner was everything Tommy Callahan wasn't: aristocratic, educated at Heidelberg, a believer in German superiority, and a man who viewed warfare as a chessboard where victory justified any sacrifice. He was arrogant, brilliant, and utterly convinced that these colonial farmers would be easy prey for a professional soldier like himself. When Steiner arrived in North Africa with his Jagdkommando team of 12 elite hunters, he studied the intelligence reports on the Australian snipers with the intensity of a man who'd found a worthy opponent. What he read both intrigued and infuriated him. These men operated with tactics that seemed almost primitive. No advanced technology, relatively simple rifles, equipment that was practically antiquated compared to German engineering. Yet their effectiveness was undeniable. Steiner's arrogance couldn't quite reconcile this paradox. In his mind, superior German military science should have made these kills impossible. The fact that some shepherd from the outback was outperforming soldiers trained in the finest military academies in Europe was an insult to everything he believed about racial and cultural superiority. He told his men with absolute certainty, "We will find this ghost they whisper about. And we will show these colonials that there are levels of skill they cannot comprehend. They may know their land, but we know war." His second in command, Lieutenant Klaus Richter, was equally dismissive. A former competitive shooter who'd won national championships, he viewed the Australian snipers as lucky amateurs who'd soon meet professional consequences. The third member of Steiner's inner circle, Unteroffizier Hans Weber, was motivated by something more personal. His younger brother had been one of those officers killed by an Australian sniper's bullet, and Weber carried that loss like a burning coal of hatred in his chest. These 3 men, each representing different dimensions of antagonism, ideological superiority, professional pride, and personal vengeance, began their hunt with absolute confidence. The first encounter happened 3 weeks into Steiner's deployment. His Jagdkommando team had set up an elaborate trap, using a dummy officer as bait in a supposedly secure observation post, with 6 counter-snipers positioned in overlapping fields of fire to triangulate any shot. It was textbook counter-sniper doctrine, executed with German precision. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the 3rd day, at dawn, the dummy took a hit. But the shot came from an angle that should have been impossible, from a position that Steiner's team had surveyed and dismissed as too exposed, too obvious. By the time they repositioned, the shooter was gone. leaving only a single disturbed rock and a carefully arranged pattern of local vegetation that had served as camouflage. Steiner was impressed despite himself, but also enraged. This wasn't luck. This was someone who understood advanced fieldcraft and had somehow anticipated their counter-sniper setup. The psychological warfare had begun. Over the following weeks, the cat-and-mouse game intensified. Tommy Callahan and his small team of Australian snipers seemed to be always one step ahead, always anticipating German counter-moves, operating with a patience that frustrated the hunters who were supposed to be hunting them. German officers continued to fall, despite increased precautions. Steiner's team would find sniper hides that had been occupied for days, complete with elaborate camouflage, empty ration tins, and sometimes, most infuriatingly, small sketches of local birds left behind like calling cards. Tommy was making a point. He could be anywhere, invisible and patient, and all the German technology and training couldn't change that fundamental equation. The tension between the hunted and the hunters created a bizarre dynamic that began to consume both sides. For Steiner, this assignment became an obsession that eclipsed all other military objectives. He started neglecting other duties, focusing exclusively on studying Tommy's patterns, trying to predict his next move. His arrogance began cracking around the edges as each failed operation chipped away at his certainty. Richter became increasingly frustrated, his professional pride wounded by the fact that this amateur was consistently outmaneuvering him. And Weber's hatred deepened into something almost pathological. He began advocating for increasingly brutal tactics, including deliberately targeting Australian medics and using wounded soldiers as bait, suggestions that even Steiner found distasteful. The psychological toll on the German hunters was becoming apparent to their own command structure. Meanwhile, Tommy Callahan was fighting his own internal battle. Every shot he took, every life he ended from distance, added weight to his soul that his stoic exterior couldn't fully conceal. His teammates noticed he'd stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, that he spent increasing amounts of time alone, staring at his notebook of sketches and natural observations, as if trying to remember what the world looked like before war. The thing that kept him functional was his philosophy. He wasn't a killer, he was a protector. Every German officer he eliminated was one less person giving orders that would send soldiers, German and Allied, to senseless deaths in frontal assaults. He was shortening the war, one strategic shot at a time. This rationalization was the thread keeping his sanity intact. The confrontation that would change everything began in November 1942, in a devastated village on the Tunisian front that had changed hands 3 times in as many weeks. Intelligence had reached Steiner that the Australian sniper team had been spotted operating in the area. And for the first time, local reconnaissance had provided something concrete. A possible identification. A Wehrmacht soldier recovering from wounds had reported seeing an older Australian soldier with distinctive sun-weathered features and carrying a rifle with unusual modifications, wrapped stock, extended barrel, entering a half-collapsed building on the village's eastern edge. Steiner saw his opportunity. He deployed his entire Jagd commando team in a coordinated operation designed not just to kill, but to capture. He wanted to prove German superiority in the most dramatic way possible, by taking this legendary ghost alive, parading him, breaking him. The village was a nightmare of rubble and exposed positions, a sniper's paradise and hell simultaneously. For 3 days the two sides maneuvered through the ruins in absolute silence, each aware of the other's presence, neither willing to make the first move that might reveal their position. The tension was suffocating. Allied and German troops in adjacent positions actually ceased other hostilities, sensing that something larger was playing out in that shattered village. A private duel between masters of their deadly craft. On the 4th day, as dawn broke with that peculiar desert light that makes distance deceptive, the silence shattered with a single rifle shot. A German spotter with Steiner's team dropped instantly, killed before he could shout a warning. The shot had come from a minaret that Steiner's team had checked twice. It should have been empty. Steiner himself led the assault on the position, his pride demanding that he be the one to corner this ghost. What he found when his team stormed the minaret's upper level was Tommy Callahan trapped in a tactical nightmare. His escape route had been blocked by a pre-dawn artillery barrage that neither side had anticipated, leaving him in a position with no retreat. For the first time in 18 months of operations, the hunter had become prey. Steiner's team surrounded the position, 12 elite soldiers against 1 exhausted sniper. The German officer called up in English, his voice carrying that particular confidence of a man who's finally won. "Australian, you are surrounded. You have nowhere to go. Your ammunition must be nearly exhausted. Come down with your hands raised, and I give you my word as an officer that you will be treated according to the rules of war." There was a long pause, so long that Steiner wondered if perhaps the sniper had been wounded in an earlier exchange they hadn't detected. Then a voice came from above, calm and unhurried, with that distinctive Australian accent that stretched vowels in a way that suggested open horizons. "Reckon I could make that difficult for you, mate? Narrow stairwell. You'd lose 3, maybe 4 men taking me. That a trade you're willing to make?" The verbal duel had begun, and it was here that the true nature of both men would be revealed through words rather than bullets. Steiner felt a flash of rage at the Australian's casual tone, as if he were discussing livestock trading rather than his imminent capture or death. "You speak of casualties as if you have leverage," Steiner responded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You are one man. We are many. Your death or capture is inevitable. The only variable is how many of my soldiers die first. Is that what you want? More death because of your pride?" There was another pause, and when Tommy spoke again, his voice carried something that surprised every German soldier listening, not fear but a kind of profound weariness that transcended the immediate tactical situation. "Pride's got nothing to do with it, friend. I'm just trying to reckon the mathematics of suffering. See? I spent 30 years raising sheep in country so empty you could scream for a week and no one would hear. Learn something out there. Every living thing matters. Every single one. Rams, ewes, lambs. Every one of them was a life I was responsible for. Lost one to thirst or snakes or dingoes, and I'd feel it for days. Now, I've spent 18 months taking lives, German lives, and I feel every single one of them too. Don't matter that they're enemy. Don't matter that they're trying to kill my mates. Every man I've put in the ground through this scope is a person who won't go home to whoever's waiting for them." The rawness in his voice created an uncomfortable silence among the German soldiers. This wasn't the defiant speech of a cornered warrior. It was something more unsettling, more human. Steiner felt his certainty waver for the first time, confronted with an enemy who spoke like a philosopher rather than a soldier. But his arrogance reasserted itself quickly, fueled by years of ideological conditioning. "Touching sentiment from a man who's killed over 200 of my countrymen," he shot back, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You speak of responsibility and suffering, yet you murder from shadows like a coward. At least have the honesty to admit what you are. A killer who justifies his actions with poetry about sheep." Richter, standing beside Steiner, added his own contempt. "You colonials always were good at pretending to be noble while doing savage work. It's in your nature, convicts and farmers playing at being soldiers." Weber's voice came next, raw with grief and hatred. "You killed my brother. He was 22 years old. Had a fiancée waiting for him in Dresden. You took that future away from him, from her, from my family. And now you want to philosophize about responsibility? I hope you're comfortable up there. Because when we drag you down, I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what you've taken from this world." The venom in their words was designed to provoke, to make Tommy react emotionally, to create the mistake that would allow them to storm his position with justification. But Tommy Callahan had learned stillness long before he'd learned to shoot. When he finally responded, his voice had that quality of controlled sadness that comes from deep moral reflection. "Your brother in Dresden," Tommy said quietly. "What was his name?" The question was so unexpected that Weber actually faltered, suspicious of manipulation but unable to resist answering. "Wilhelm. Lieutenant Wilhelm Weber. He'd been promoted just 3 weeks before your bullet found him." Tommy was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried perfectly in the stone acoustics of the ruined building. "I remember that shot. November 3rd. He was observing from a damaged building, northeast sector, coordinating artillery that was pinning down an entire company of my countrymen in open ground. They would have been slaughtered, 40, maybe 50 boys with nowhere to hide and shells landing among them. I waited 11 hours for a shot that would end that barrage without hitting the radio operator or the runner. Just the officer giving coordinates. Your brother died instantly. He never knew what happened. And for what? It's worth. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that war made me the instrument of your family's grief. I'm sorry that your brother was in a position where his expertise was being used to kill men who had families waiting for them too. I'm sorry that any of us are here, in this God-forsaken desert, killing each other over lines on maps drawn by old men in distant capitals who will never set foot in the places they send us to die for." The raw sincerity in his words hit like a physical force, creating a moment of cognitive dissonance for the German soldiers who'd expected defiance, excuses, or pleading, anything but genuine remorse from a man who'd been so effective at killing. Steiner felt control of the situation slipping away. Felt the psychological advantage shifting in ways he couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The enemy was supposed to be afraid, or angry, or desperately negotiating. Instead, this Australian was somehow making them, the victors, the ones with overwhelming force, feel like the ones being questioned, being judged. Steiner's voice rose, sharp and cutting. Don't you dare try to manipulate us with false sympathy. You're a killer trying to escape consequences. We don't need your apologies or your philosophy. What we need is for you to face justice for your actions. You've committed acts of warfare that border on terrorism, systematically targeting officers, creating fear that paralyzes entire units. You violated the soldiers' code of combat. Tommy's response came with an edge now, the first hint of steel beneath his humble exterior. The soldiers' code? That's rich, mate. I've seen what your army does to civilians in occupied territories. I've watched from my scope as villages were reprisals, aid for resistance they had nothing to do with. I've seen your officers order executions of prisoners because keeping them was inconvenient. Don't lecture me about codes of warfare when your entire command structure is built on brutality, justified by ideology that says some humans are worth less than others. I kill officers because officers give orders. And in your army, too many of those orders involve atrocities. Every shot I take is a calculation. Will removing this person from the battlefield save more lives than it takes? That's the only code I answer to. The code of reducing suffering wherever I can. The observation struck at the heart of something the German soldiers had been avoiding in their own minds. The uncomfortable reality of what they'd witnessed and sometimes participated in during this war. Richter tried to deflect, his voice defensive. You don't know anything about our operations or our orders. You sit in your hide sites, looking through your scope at limited glimpses, and think you understand the complexity of occupation and military governance. Tommy's laugh was short and bitter. Limited glimpses? Friend, I've spent more time watching your command structures operate than you have. I've seen the orders passed, the gestures made, the way your officers interact with local populations. When you spend 18 hours motionless watching a target, you see everything. You see who shows respect and who shows contempt. You see which officers protect civilians and which ones exploit them. You see humanity in some and its absence in others. That's the burden of what I do. I don't just take lives. I witness them first. Every man I've killed, I knew something about before I pulled that trigger. I knew whether he shouted at his subordinates or spoke patiently, whether he shared his rations or kept extra for himself, whether he looked at locals as people or as obstacles. I carry all of that with me every day. So don't tell me I don't understand complexity. I understand it better than I ever wanted to. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Steiner's team exchanged glances. This wasn't going at all according to plan. They'd expected to capture or kill an enemy sniper and instead found themselves in a moral confrontation they weren't prepared for. Weber, still driven by grief and rage, tried to reassert the narrative. Beautiful words from a man hiding in a tower, waiting to die. You want to talk about moral complexity? Then come down here and face us with honor instead of cowering behind stone walls. But before Tommy could respond, something unexpected happened. A young German private, barely 18 by his appearance, who'd been part of the perimeter security, spoke up nervously, his voice cracking slightly. Hauptmann Steiner? I think I know who this is. My cousin Ernst was captured by the Australians at Tobruk last year. He wrote home about it. They treated their prisoners well, gave them medical care, shared food and water when they didn't have to. He said there was an older Australian soldier who spoke some German, who played harmonica for them at night and talked about stars and philosophy. He said this soldier told them, "We're not fighting you. We're fighting the machine that brought you here. You're just men, same as us." My cousin said it was the only reason he kept his sanity in captivity. Hauptmann, what if this is that same man? What if this is... He trailed off, afraid of the implications. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, and Steiner felt his carefully constructed narrative begin to fracture. He turned on the young private, voice sharp. That is speculation and irrelevant to our mission. The enemy's treatment of prisoners has nothing to do with his tactical crimes against our officer corps. But the seed had been planted, and other soldiers began whispering among themselves. Tommy's voice drifted down, now carrying a different weight. What's your cousin's name, son? The young private, emboldened and nervous in equal measure, replied, Ernst Hartmann, sir. He's from a small town near Munich. Tommy paused, then spoke with the careful precision of recalled memory. Ernst. Yeah, I remember Ernst. Tall. Kid, bit skinny, had a photograph of a girl and a dog that he showed everyone. Wouldn't shut up about how his Helga made the best apple strudel in Bavaria. Used to draw cartoons in the sand with a stick. He was actually pretty good, had real talent. Kept trying to sketch all of us even though we told him to save his energy. He was one of the good ones. You could see it in how he treated others, even in captivity, even when he was scared and hungry. Is he still alive? Did he make it home? The specificity, the genuine concern in the question, landed like a hammer blow to Steiner's certainty.